This podcast is sponsored by PAX. Whether on the water, on land or in the air, PAX bags are both versatile and flexible backpacks that are perfectly suitable for your requirements in the most demanding of environments. PAX bags are highly regarded due to their exceptional performance in pre-hospital and in critical care environments. Their well-organised compartments and customisable configurations enhance efficiency in high-stress situations. They're designed with infection control in mind and are easy to clean and disinfect. So highly visible colours and reflective strips aid quick identification and adherence to quality standards, ensuring reliability. So the versatility of PAX bags caters to diverse EMS providers, and they deliver vital equipment, durability and ease of use for pre-hospital critical care services globally. I've used PAX bags in a number of critical care situations, and they're absolutely excellent, both in identification of kit, but also in identification of the reflective strips to ensure visibility. So please see the show notes for further details.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome back to the podcast. In this episode, we're going to be exploring decision making in high pressure environments. So this is going to be part 2 of the conversation on decision making. And in this episode, we're going to explore mental models, training and strategies that enable effective decision making in extreme environments. So from managing stress to maintaining clarity to balancing experience with instinct. So we're also going to discuss leadership, teamwork, and ethical dilemmas that arise in emergencies. So we're also going to look at how we navigate risk, resource limitation, post-incident reflection, and lessons learned from incidents. And we're also going to look at how we can learn as pre-hospital staff from other domains such as firefighting and vice versa when it comes to making the best possible decisions under pressure. So to do this, I have Olly Sapsford with me. Olly is a Firefighter and Commander within the London Fire Brigade, and he's also a lecturer in disaster and emergency management at Coventry University. So his research focuses on human factors, socio-cognitive influences, and decision-making in high-pressure environments. He is particularly interested in the role of intuition and expertise in fast decision-making. So Olly recently spoke at the College of Paramedics Emergency and Critical Care Conference to present his talk, From the Fireground, Demystifying Extreme Decision Making for Emergency Responders. And we're going to just really dig into his experience in decision making. Welcome to the podcast, Olly.
How you doing, all right?
So Olly, I just wondered if we could start with looking at some uniting principles that apply to really both firefighting and paramedicine around making quick decisions under pressure. Could I get you to speak to, just in your mind, some of these united principles that really apply to all of us?
Well, I think the main thing for me is the nature of the instance we're all attending. I mean, regardless of what uniform you've got on, by the very nature of emergency incidents are complex, aren't they? They're challenging, they're dynamic, they involve uncertainty in quite large amounts. They're high stake, you're making decisions under a lot of pressure. You're often making teams in a context where your goals are shifting, your goals are unclear. You're dealing with large volumes of information. I think one of the uniting things that affects all decision making is the fact that without good situational awareness or situation awareness, it's impossible to make good decisions. And I think that's obviously something that works across the board, regardless of industry. As well, I've made my, I think in my own practice, I've made my peace with the fact that I'm going to be making decisions in circumstances where I haven't got a full picture of information, especially under a lot of pressure when the risk is high. Potentially when as well I'm at my cognitively lowest points, 2 o'clock in the morning, when everybody's brain is fuzzy, regardless of what you've got going on. I think those are some of the real commonalities of what we're dealing with. And it's the organisational pressures we work within as well. Resourcing, crewing, these kind of things, which probably affects the paramedics and the ambulance service a bit more than it maybe does people on my side of the coin. I don't know. But these are the things that for me are kind of at the heart of this.
So I just want to really look at mental models, Olly, and just really, if I could get you to speak to really how we use mental models in decision making. So one of the things we've said on the podcast before is one of the more famous mental models is OODA loops. So observe, orientate, decide, and act. And the orientation has always been the most challenging part in flash teams. So orientating yourself to the environment to feed a decision, despite maybe changing teams, despite fatigue, despite being day or night, weekend, morning, afternoon, evening. Could I get you to speak to just these decision-making models and indeed how we use them to facilitate the complex decisions with ever-changing teams and despite human factors?
I think the biggest thing about it is when you talk about the OODA loops there, like, orientation. I think how we frame things is so important. Again, that comes from our own perspectives. So I'm fortunate in what I do, like the university. I meet a lot of people from a lot of different sectors. Who come together to have these discussions, whether or not it's in lectures or seminars or focus groups. But we all approach emergency incidents from our own particular framing, don't we? Depending on the uniform we wear. And for me, that's really key, because we turn up to these events with, like, we've all got goals in mind. We've all got the same overall objective of solving the problem, like resolve the incident. But every team that turns up there to form these multi teams has got their own particular set of ambitions and goals they need to deal with. And I think the biggest thing about all of this is like situational awareness, isn't it? Within a lot of services, within the fire service especially, we've got a model for situational awareness that comes from Mika Rensley, a 1995 model, which essentially looks at, we've got 3 stages of: you gather information, you understand it, and then you try and predict what's going to happen in the future. And I think good decision making comes from the basis of good situational awareness. The key thing about situational awareness, though, is that it only lasts for a split second. So what you knew 10 seconds ago at 11:28 in the morning, by 11:29, 11:30, that can change. That can change dramatically, especially in our industries. In terms of mental models, I mean, I know you spoke before about like Stanley Kahneman and the idea of you have a system 1 and a system 2 brain. And looking back at the research into like dynamic decision making in the fire service, for example, across the UK, Scandinavia, Europe, and the United States, there's always been this kind of dichotomy between the system 1 brain, where you've got very intuitive, very rapid, reflexive decisions being made based on mental models, based on previous experience, based on schemata, which are activated by environmental cues. We've also got the other side of the coin, the system 2 brain, which is governing analytical styles decision making, which is a lot slower, more deliberate. And I know you spoke before about these heuristics, which are like our mental shortcuts for dealing with sort of familiar situations. And I think in terms of like models and strategies for decision making, it's important, like, for decision makers to recognize that these are the things that are in play. You've got a system 1 and system 2 brain, whether you like it or not. Now, there are some sectors and some people in some parts of academia that don't necessarily agree with that. You could argue that your system 2 brain is actually the post hoc rationalization of your system 1 brain. But whatever way you think about it, they're both reliant on each other. You cannot silence your system 1 brain, your experience-based brain. It's one of those things where you can control it. You can learn to manage your biases. You can be aware of your biases. You can be aware of the things that potentially lead you down the road of decision traps, which can use to poor decision making. But you can't switch it off. In terms of fire service, for example, back in sort of 2015, we came up, a lot of the work that was done at Cardiff University came up with the idea of decision controls. So there's an acceptance that, we make intuitive decisions, which are based on seeing a situation and reacting to it in a very short amount of time. But we actually double check that thinking with the decision control process, which is essentially it's a set of rapid mental checks, of our goals, of our, the anticipated consequences of our decision making, and actually a look at a risk assessment. Does the risks, and the benefits still line up? But the benefits of our course of action still outweighing the risks. Now, in terms of firefighting, any firefighters listening to this will know that you've been in the job any amount of time. If someone says to you, start up, that those 2 words can initiate a whole load of action. For those of us who aren't in the service or in that world, start up is essentially get your BA set to work, so you're ready to make entry to a fire and commence firefighting and commence rescue. And that, for me, is one of the biggest examples of how intuitive practice can come into play. That's not to say that people doing that, working in that kind of way, I think, are working thoughtlessly. They're accessing a whole wealth of experientially gained knowledge, which is, there they click of the fingers, which is so important in such sectors. The big thing about that kind of decision making and that kind of work, though, is the fact that it can be vulnerable to bias. As I've already said, and it's important that we have an awareness of that. In my own research, it's doing some bits up in Greater Manchester with the fire service there, observing fire commanders and firefighters working in realistic training scenarios. It was really interesting to see how, sort of 9 years down the line of the introduction of these decision controls, that there was a lot of examples of actually people checking their thinking, conferring with other people about what they were seeing, and it's not a simple thing; it's a complex thing, and this is a thing. Essentially, there's two sides of the coin. There's the see and do, and there's the see, think, do, and all of those things are hugely governed by, constraints of time and risk.
So something you said some really interesting things there, Olly, actually, and I'd like to really zoom in on just how the fire brigade trains for decision making. So one of the things you said there is start up, and like you said, from a decision control perspective, that initiates a whole lot of sequential action just based on that, which isn't the decision to be made really by the team on that, as in that's just a command which takes decision making out of the picture, because you can then all be ready for in a generic sense for that incident. So there's like almost these initial decision controls which are quite sequential and quite maybe easy to make. Could I get you to speak to how you've been trained, or indeed how the fire brigade trains for some more complex decision making down the line for like multifactorial decisions?
Across the board, we work from National Operational Guidance in the UK, and we're very at the top of that. In terms of like decision making, we've got a decision making model, which essentially is based on like an analytical model. Where you gather information, you from a variety of sources, you come up with a set of objectives and define a course of action for executing it. And that, again, that's something that's available across the board, that we use across the board. And that's drilled in from kind of day one almost. And the interesting thing about that as well, again, as time's gone on and things have developed, especially from, since 2015, when sort of a whole load of new research in the field hit the ground, based on like real data gathered from real incidents, live incidents. There's like the idea of decision controls has been built into that to recognise the kind of dual processes that are in play. Is it that simple? Probably not. In terms of the actual training of things, I think, as the fire service is evolving, and here we are in 2025, I think there's a big emphasis now on crews and decision makers understanding the processes that are at play. Human factors as a concept, and non-technical skills training as a concept is becoming much more of a central issue, especially in the UK, especially in Europe. And I know I'm biased because of my interests, and because of the sort of work I do outside of the brigade, but it feels like this is becoming a thing that's in much more in vogue. And some of my experiences working and meeting with paramedics and medical teams and HEMS teams and critical care people. This thing seems to be something that's becoming much more apparent. And again, I'm fortunate. I've always worked for brigades where training's been feels like it's been a priority. From National Operational Guidance, we've got a decision making model, which by its nature is analytical. It's the idea that we gather information, we form objectives, we form a plan, we execute it. It involves communication, it involves controlling the plan, and then we review the outcomes and we continually evaluate. It's like a cyclic process. Within this, that recently, since 2015, they've adopted the idea of decision controls, the idea there's a duality of process on the go with intuitive processes in there as well. But it's something that's constantly evolving. And training these days in the fire service really reflects that. There's now there seems to be an ever-growing emphasis on the non-technical skills, that enhance our technical skills. A renewed sort of an emphasis on the human factors potentially, which that isn't just, as far as I can see, isn't just within the fire service. That's across the board now, across all sort of high fidelity industries. It's becoming more of a talking point. I mean, you only have to switch on LinkedIn and have a little flick through to see what's going on there, and you can see this playing out. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, no, indeed. I would agree with that actually, Olly. And I guess that leads me into the next question, which is how you mitigate some of these individual, team, or task human factors from a stress perspective. So, say you're on scene and you start to see certainly the team not performing well under stress, or indeed even individually. Could I get you to speak to maybe some individual methods and or team methods that you use to really mitigate stress and I guess in a way come to a predefined outcome from your experience?
Uh, I think it wouldn't be right for me to speak about individual teams and individual things, especially in terms of fire service. But I think again, I've spoken already about being fortunate in terms of doing what I do outside of the brigade with the role at Coventry, and spent some time working with all kinds of different teams, control teams, firefighting teams, medic teams, who everyone's working under stress, aren't they? Everyone experiences stress in different ways. In terms of teams, one of the real key sort of strategies that we sort of stumbled across the fact that actually it's kind of declaring it. People recognizing in their own teams the signs of stress, the signs of stress in individuals, and actually also recognizing those signs in themselves, and actually having the psychological safety, the confidence, the I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but having the ability to actually feel safe to declare those things. That again, working, again, sort of a small scale kind of research focus group kind of projects in the north of England, it sort of really demonstrated that was really powerful. I think as well, reflective practice is really important. And in my own kind of experiences of, some of the more unpleasant things we deal with potentially, I found that the ability to go away and make my peace with it is important in terms of managing stress. Because if you can go away from a situation and fully understand what's happened, if you can fully understand the bigger picture of it all and why things happened, in why decisions were made, and the kind of, in the context they're made, then I think that's a big weapon in the arsenal for protecting yourselves. But equally as well, in terms of teams and other people, I think it's important that everybody shares that knowledge, that and that ability, that reflective practice as well. But it's sometimes easier said than done. I think as well, if a personal perspective, anyone who's done any time in the fire service have been told a million times about, you've got about 5 spans of control, 5 to 7, maybe 3, depends on, who you are, what day of the week it is, how you're feeling, what things are affecting your grey matter, But I think I find personally, if, in under high pressure, in working under high pressure, making decisions under high pressure, if you're able to offload some of that burden, if you're, I'm always talk about, like, you have a cognitive bandwidth, you've mentioned it before on your previous episodes, and if you can offload things to reduce your like the burden on your bandwidth, it frees up space to actually release some of that pressure, which I think is hugely important.
Yeah, so you mentioned, Ollie, before about system one and system two thinking. So system one thinking being, as you quite rightly said, this fast, intuitive, instinctual decision making, which is, like you said, it's more intuitive. There is not just intuition there, there's probably heuristic built into that, versus system two, which is far more slower, deliberate, and analytical decision making. I, I guess in a way, my question would be around how do you slow teams down to make maybe less instinctual decisions? Is it good to slow teams down? Instinct, I guess, in a way, serves us well in a lot of decisions, but introducing maybe a bit more analytical, well thought through decision making might sometimes be of benefit. Could I just speak to that sort of push pull of when, shouting startup probably is the right thing to do. So everyone's coming to a predefined endpoint initially. But then when do you start to introduce maybe a bit more system two thinking? Is it just when things become a bit more complex, or is it when you start to see the team losing grasp a little bit more of a situation? What's the interplay for you?
I think there's two things. I think the distinction between instinct and intuitive is really important. So working intuitively is kind of what we're talking about here in terms of the system one brain. And even then, that idea of a commando or whoever, a fire commander saying start up to a BA crew, that's not just a carte blanche of just blind action. That's the initiation of a whole load of protocols and processes and things. It's going to involve a briefing at some point. It's going to involve a lot of a lot of skills and drills, technical skills that have been that have been trained so hard that they're now conditioned processes. I think that's the important thing there. It's not, your intuitive working, intuitive decision making like that, isn't just blind action. A fire commander telling a air crew to start up. We talked about earlier on about how the nature of emergency instances are, you're dealing with uncertainty a lot of the time. A lot of the time you turn up to a situation, you've got a rough idea of what's going on, say a building fire, potentially people trapped in a part of the building. You've got a rough idea. But apart from that, that's all you really know. You take a look at the building, you've got a rough idea of what the building is, what its purpose is, what potentially you might find inside there because of the way it's constructed, because of what the building does. But to get action happening, to get the ball rolling, to make a decision towards, resolving these like difficult, complex goals you're potentially facing, the phrase "start up" is the use of that kind of language, the use of those kind of processes is like the initiation of that. That gets crews working, that gets things happening to start filling in the gaps. As soon as a crew makes entry to a burning building, for example, the commander or the instant commander's situational awareness is going to change because all of a sudden the picture gets deeper. We talk about having a three-dimensional picture, but all of a sudden they've got more information. And once action's underway, by the nature of how incidents play out and not the incident timeline and how time pressure and how risk potentially behave under those circumstances, then things become more analytical potentially. No, but and that's not to say that these two processes aren't happening at the same time. Somebody who's good at what they'll do, who's got experience, who's, pardon me, an expert, will turn up at a situation and immediately will be double checking their thinking, despite acting intuitively based on what we can call conditioned processes. So they might, start up, make entry, right hand directional search, all these kind of things that we do as our day-to-day thing we do. But at the same time, in your head, you're thinking, well, has this place got a basement? Is this definitely a fire? Is this, what time of day is it? Are people definitely in there? Or what's the information? Where am I getting the information from? Is this good information? Is this bad information? Have we been here before? Has somebody else here been here before? Do they know the building? There's so many different things at play, which make decision making so complex in situations. And that's the key thing, and again, I think I've seen it, watching people make decisions in high pressure situations. Again, talking about, working up with Manchester with the crews there. As people were making decisions, they're reflecting with each other. We're doing X, Y, and Z. This is what we've got. What have you seen? The idea of like building a bigger picture. Gathering greater situational awareness. What's become clear, in my own observations, a couple of summers ago, is the fact that people routinely go back to situation assessment. People routinely go back to looking for more information. And I think that's the kind of practice. No matter how intuitively or analytically your decision making is, or how we're working, as long as people are constantly revisiting, actively prospecting for more information, then you've got a situation where work's getting done in an environment that requires really rapid, fast work to save life, to save property, to minimize hazards, to resolve an incident. Because in our world, as soon as the fire goes out, a lot of your problems go away. Quite frankly. But equally, the picture of information is constantly growing. So then, when other decision makers turn up onto the scene to contribute to that party, then there's a wealth of information now that's then, useful. And also you have the people turning up, other decision makers, other commanders, people with maybe more rank or from a higher scale, then have ability to reframe that information and look at it again and to fill in the dots.
So something you mentioned before, Ollie, around, and I really like this, and my question is around coordination and team coordination. Something you said before is, shared situation awareness is a moment in time, and actually what we need to keep doing is, it's like with the SBAR updates to an emergency operations center, it is keep giving SBAR updates. So there is a collective sense of situation awareness, and it's every 5 or 10 minutes because, like you said, things are changing moment by moment. Could I get you to speak to that team coordination, just how you, even just on the ground, how you synchronize with other team colleagues, just to make sure that there is a semblance of, in a way, of united decision making on the ground in a dynamic situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we think, I was thinking about this as you're talking. Interoperability is a big deal. In the UK, like the incident management system in the UK, it's not just a single entity, is it? In the States, there's FEMA at the moment, at least, which is there's like a single system almost that governs these things. In the UK, you've got lots of different agencies, from lots of different jurisdictions with overlapping geographical boundaries, and like we say, the idea of multi-team systems coming together to resolve incidents is a day-to-day thing, and that's whether it's turning up to a car fire, a small road traffic collision, or it's a major incident. In the UK, we've got the Jessup principles, which have been around for quite a while now, and they give us some of those like key principles that we're all working from the same hymn book from. In terms of actually, like the nitty gritty. I mean, the key part of that's communication. So it's all very well having good situational awareness, whatever that might look like at the time. But unless that's communicated and shared, developing a common understanding of risk, a joint understanding of risk, then you're kind of a non-starter. Again, we've spoken already about how these multi-team systems, teams are turning up on an ad hoc basis. You might not have worked with them before. Your crew of firefighters might not have met the paramedics who are turning up to the scene to do their job. So it's how do you develop that commonality? And again, a big part of that's trust, isn't it? There's the idea of trust is such a key part of decision making in terms of all kinds of things, leadership, intra-team working, inter-team working, all these kind of different things. If you've got trust, you can develop trust, and that often comes from clear team identities, clear identification of goals, like clear delineation of like roles and responsibilities. Communication, good communication is such a big part of that. That's open communication that works two ways, where there's the opportunity for feedback. For me, those are some of the real key aspects of that, the things at the heart of it. And there's also, it's actually, it comes down to cultural as well. Organizational culture is a big deal at the moment. It's a buzzword. And that's those are not my words. That's what you heard it said a lot. Organizational culture is a buzzword, but it's an important thing. For bringing our services into the modern age a bit more potentially. And it's somehow making sure that organizations and teams and individuals have got that ability, have got whatever it is, the cultural capital within them to actually facilitate these things. Historically, Jessup has potentially struggled to be embedded in within organisations. These principles for interoperability. Thinking of your American audience, and that's not just me saying that willy nilly. That's something that's been written about. It's published research. It's a thing. And there's now a lot of work going on into how we develop these things and how we train in a better way to adopt them. And trust and team identity and clear goal orientation and issues such as that within positive safe organizational cultures are really, really key things.
So Ollie, just pivoting and looking at leadership, because you did just mention leadership, and I think that's a fascinating concept that really plays into decision making. And none of this is simple, and I think hence why you're just about to study at a PhD level, is that the leadership can really influence decision making within a team for better or worse, and also team of teams. So it can have an effect at multiple levels. Could I get you to speak to really, in your mind, what good leadership looks like within decision making within a team?
That's like the million dollar question, isn't it? I mean, you log on if you to load up, Amazon or World of Books or any other kind of website that vlogs things to you. You'll probably find, I think, like my last time I checked, it's like 53,000 different leadership volumes available there for you to go and read and to go and so and so does it this way, so and so does it that way. I mean, however way you look at leadership, I'm no expert. I think regardless of your discipline, regardless of the uniform you wear or the job you do or your role or your rank or whatever, it's like you just said, it's a really critical part of everything. In the sense the fire service in the UK, the National Chiefs Fire Council, the NFCC, offer up a leadership framework that demonstrates, that says leadership should be present from the chief fire officer down to your recruit and the first day they put their uniform on. What that looks like and how that plays out is obviously very different, depending on what you're doing. But it's a key thing, and I think trust is at the heart of good leadership. We could sit here for an hour and talk about different leadership styles, servant leadership, all that kind of stuff. If you go on a leadership course, you'll probably see the same old tropes, thrown out onto the page repeatedly. Fine, they're good, they're interesting. I suppose they're a good place to start from. But I think maybe the way forward is to kind of look at leadership from the point of actually the followership. One of the leaders, I was told by somebody a few years back that the more responsibility you have, the more rank or whatever you want to call it you have in an organization, the more responsibility you have for the people you work for. And maybe potentially how we frame leadership is really critical. There's this constant tension between the hierarchy and the network. A lot of our systems and like emergency preparedness, emergency response, disaster response, they're very hierarchical systems, aren't they? Gold, silver, bronze, strategic, tactical, operational. But actually, in reality, when these multi-team systems come together, or any team, system comes together, different firefighters from different fire stations come together to resolve an incident. Actually, that hierarchy very soon turns into a network. I think for me, that's the really critical thing. It's the network. And that is just important for interoperability as well. Where teams from different disciplines are coming together. I think one of the best leadership phrases I've ever heard of, has been like some incident commander turns up or a fire commander or whoever turns up at an incident. The first question is to the other people there, what have you got? What do you need? That's two questions actually. But to me, that's really critical. I've read a good book recently by a guy called Lieutenant Colonel Langley Sharp from the British Army. It's from the Centre of Army Leadership. It's called The Habit of Excellence. And he proposes quite an interesting model where actually, leadership, command, and management are split into three separate things. Where potentially leadership looks at your wider culture. You sort of setting the boundaries for the way you're working, for the good and the bad. Command is very much commands we know it, dealing with the high pressure stuff, the instant stuff. And then management is, I got in trouble recently for calling it the paperwork, but management deals with the people issues, maybe things like sickness or discipline, the things we don't really like to deal with, but they're essential to making teams work in a good way, in a positive way. So I think it's really important, and multi-agency working, again, coming back to the hierarchy, is really, really key. I think it's really, really important. Now, what that hierarchy looks like and how we develop it and what that looks like at an individual instance can be 100 different things depending on who's there, and what's going on, how big the hierarchy is. You're talking about a major national incident, for example, a major incident, something like an MTFA incident. Well, that network is huge, isn't it? You contrast that to a 4-pump house fire where there's a number of firefighters at a scene with some paramedics and police officers dealing with the situation. They're two completely different things, but the same principles I think apply. Good leadership isn't about the leader; it's about the team. It's about the followers. And there's a great thing I read recently, which I called zombie leadership, which is about reframing leadership from the perspective of actually you measure it, you value it, you evaluate it from the terms of actually what the people working in the team think. So instead of a leader and a team, leadership becomes an integral part of the team. Teamwork and task work. The task work of those teams becomes an essential part of leadership. So instead of having the cult of a single person, actually, how good leadership is very much reflected in how effective the team is, how good the outputs are from the team. I think that's a really interesting perspective. It's a real reframing of leadership.
Yeah, no, indeed, I would agree. I would agree with that. I think the ability to democratize the perspective of the team. We've spoken on the podcast before around this unifocal perspective of a leader, that you almost need to resource the observations of the team to make sure you're not missing anything. And I think good leadership resources the team. It gives the team voice, as you were saying, and it also allows the team to speak into your decision making and your practice, which I think is a powerful pivot from, like you said, a hierarchical team, which is pretty siloed and you'll do as I think, do as I say, which we know actually facilitates mistakes and error. So that's really, really interesting, actually.
You just got me thinking now. Like, again, I think that's not to say that the hierarchy isn't important, because I think in terms of safe systems of work and the health and safety of the work we do, it's important to have that. Even like hierarchy for sense of chains of communication, chains of command. But having a hierarchy that's smart enough to facilitate a network. That has the ability to facilitate the network, because that's where the value is. We've spoken already about the importance of time and risk in terms of the pressures that affect decision making. So when time and risk, when time pressure is high and risk is high, in terms of command, for example, we haven't always got the time to make decisions via democracy. It's very much an instant commander saying X, Y, and Z, please. However, once the action's underway and there's a bit more breathing room, that network soon comes into play. Other responders turn up on the scene. This is what we've got. This is what we need. What do you see? What do you see? What do you see? And then things develop, and that network develops. I think, like you say, it's breaking down those silos, which is important. There's an instant recently where something got sorted out, and a police sergeant said to me, "We're getting better at this, aren't we?" With a grin on her face. And it's like, yeah, it's a recognition that actually the network, that network style working is becoming really, quite effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that interplay, as you were saying before. Actually, hierarchy is needed at some points, but there is this interplay between dynamic decision making further down the line, and it's an interplay. Sometimes it needs to be one thing, and actually that's the most efficient thing, and another time it's another thing. And actually it's mandating, it's knowing when to use each one depending on the situation, as you were saying. Olly, could you get to speak to ethical decision making? I think the problem with complex decisions, or not even complex, even in, like say, maybe simple fires or 4-pump fires, 3-pump fires, there might be a semblance of ethical decision making which you have to make. Maybe talking about more choice of who you treat. Do you migrate towards a pediatric patient versus an adult patient? Who do you go for first? It's fraught with the pre-hospital and firefighting environment. It's fraught with these kind of decisions. Could I get you to speak to maybe how you would counsel colleagues, or indeed in a debrief, some of the learning around ethical decision making and how to make it in the moment and how to think about it?
We keep saying how complex these things are, don't we? It seems like every time we speak, it's like, this is really complex, but it is. I think the big thing about it is that it's a fundamental part of what we do, regardless of the uniform you wear, isn't it? Like, if you can't ethically rationalize your decisions, you're kind of really not in a good place. Like some of the things you've picked up on there, how do you make those decisions? Like, the moral pressures at play there, the social pressures, things like the wider context you're making those decisions in, they're huge, aren't they? Like the fire service thing was 2021, we had a national core code of ethics that was introduced. Is developed collaboratively between the NFCC and like local government associations, actually the Association of like Police and Crime Commissioners, and it gave us these sort of 5 ethical principles, based on integrity, dignity, respect, leadership, EDI, putting communities first. I suppose that's like from a legislative point of view and from an organisational point of view, those are kind of the bigger things. When it comes to actually, when it comes to decision making on the ground, like you talked about pediatrics there, and we talk about savable life, don't we? For the fire service maxim, that is about saving savable life, saving savable property. But it comes down to teams and individuals. Your first responsibility is your personal safety, your team safety, and then making sure that you can do your best for the public, do your best for the people who need us. So it's hugely complex. And I think a key part of dealing with that comes back to organizational culture. It comes back to that psychological safety potentially of understanding fully the context you're working in, but also actually fully understanding that a big thing about the work we do, and I say that collectively, is the fact that you can make all of the right decisions but still have poor outcomes. This is it's a real factor of of the industry of all of regardless of you're wearing fire kit or if you're wearing a green uniform, like you can make all the right decisions at the right time based on what to be true, which you can rationalize, but you can still have poor outcomes, and that's a really difficult thing potentially to deal with. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's complex. It's complex. I know it just sounds like a get out of jail free card say it's complex, but it is complex. And actually, how we embed these ethical principles, into into the day-to-day is a really difficult thing.
So, Ollie, just looking at training, could I get you to speak to some of the differences in training that firefighters receive, and indeed how that looks on the ground and is enacted, that we could really pull across to paramedicine, that's really valuable in the training phase, but also in your anecdotal experience on the ground.
The big thing for me, about training is like generally when you look at like training literature, there's a big distinction between two types of knowing, two types of knowledge. We've got our declarative knowledge or explicit knowledge, which is the fact-based stuff. This is stuff that we learn in lectures, we learn, reading books and seminars, reading the manuals. In the terms of fire service, you have the firefighters manuals, these kind of things. When it comes to decision making, like how, I always sort of question how useful is that stuff to develop competence in terms of decision making. The other side of things is our tacit knowledge or procedural knowledge, the knowing how to do things. And this is like, these are the things that we acquire through through undertaking tasks, for physically doing actions, through making decisions, receiving feedback, through reflecting. Um, Policies and procedures can be, explicit knowledge can be readily taught, but actually learning through experience is the key thing that helps the decision maker decide when and how to apply those things, or to adopt or set aside those procedures in preference for something else. In the fire service, we have operational discretion, which is where we're confronted with a situation that exceeds the boundaries, the plans, the patterns we're used to working in. So it gives us the room to step outside of policy potentially for a very limited amount of time for very specific reasons. I love it. Dr. Phil Butler, he talks about the rules, the paradox of having rules, so we haven't got any rules. It's brilliant. And it's a real thing. But I think, in terms of training, the big thing for me is that the best training I've ever experienced, has been the training that's been the most realistic. So, like personally, like going to the fire service college where basically they can set everything on fire, crash everything into everything, give you all these kind of fantastic real world, real looking scenarios with actors running around doing real things. That's the best kind of training, because it gives you the idea to actually, it gives you the ability to develop these experiences, to experiential learning, to develop the mental models, the schemata, the memory files that you then access when you're under pressure, when your cognitive bandwidth is absolutely maxed out, when you need to draw on those things to make good decisions. Well, actually training that is as realistic as possible to real life gives you the ability to build those. I like, the fact that we have our technical skills, the things that are skills and drills, the things that we develop and we train and we build into our condition processes. But we've also got the non-technical skills, which are just as important. Things like how we gather situational awareness, how we make decisions, understanding how teams work and task work happens, understanding leadership properly, understanding communication, developing communication skills, understanding how we manage our own stress and manage the stress of teams, how we build resilience and develop resilience. I think those are key things that have to be trained. Again, I've spoken already about, doing research with Great Manchester Fire and Rescue Service, watching their commanders working in simulated incidents and their firefighters doing the same thing. And the real thing that struck me, as I was looking at that footage we recorded and was, sort of doing the analysis, the humanity analysis, was the fact that in the situations where real fire was being burnt, and there was real smoke, real flame, the body language, the behaviour of everybody on that scene changed. The firefighters in the background, we're getting their equipment ready, their BA sets, could see them moving in a really just instinctive, in kind of way you do. Like if anyone's ever worn a BA set, there's always a bit of shuffling around to get it comfortable on your back. You could see them doing it. You could hear the incident commanders heart beating in the body cameras where they were wearing. The actions became real. The language changed. The behaviour changed. I've already spoken at the beginning of this about the phrase "start up." These things became more real. They reflected to me more what you'd see happening on an Instagram potentially than some of the scenarios that were more based in simulation. So, for example, white powder instance, hazmat instance, where everybody knew that was a bag of flour that had been thrown on the floor, but for the purpose of the exercise, it was something more sinister. But that realism, that was so key. And that again comes back to kind of what we spoke about earlier on about bandwidth. How do you, talk about the Yertz-Dodson curve, the green zone, that bandwidth of the good zone, that green zone we've got where we're sort of working in to our most, our highest sort of capacity. But how do we, for me, training is about training in the best kind of way is about making that capacity bigger. You train hard to really build in your skills and drills, like putting ladders up, wearing BA sets, getting hose to work, using hydraulic rescue equipment. What that looks like for paramedics, is probably 100 different things, but you train hard in those things, so your technical skills are built in, which then frees up the bandwidth. So when you're under pressure, when you're really having you work in those high pressure moments, you've got the grey matter available still to deal with those effectively, to make good decisions, rationalize decision making, think about your thinking, metacognate. You've got all that extra bandwidth to do that. And that's the thing I'm sort of passionate about. Systems fail. I'm a big believer in that. The system will always fail. Systems fail. That's just the nature of systems thinking, systems theory. But you can train individuals to be more resilient in those situations.
Just as we come into land, Ollie, that's fascinating, by the way. And there's almost a podcast just in that, actually.
There's a whole podcast there,
yeah. But just as we come into land, I'd just like to look at debrief and post-incident reflection, actually, and just get your thoughts on really how you reflect on the outcome in firefighting, and indeed maybe in paramedicine. Is there a similar process to debriefing that you've been trained in, just to evaluate your decisions after the incident?
I mean, yeah, I think debriefing it's important in a whole kind of several different ways, isn't it? It's the mechanism for individuals and teams, and organisations potentially to learn and improve from the actions, and to improve their performance. From the point of view of the teams on the scene, individuals on the scene, it's about reducing the ambiguity around the event, isn't it? I've already said earlier on how, for me, some of the best ways of moving forwards from some of the potentially the hardest things we've had to deal with is having a good understanding of what happened, when, and why. It's kind of that retrospective sense making, isn't it? Which allows team members who are potentially scattered all over a scene to actually, during the incident, to actually develop a consensus about the why and the how. To understand the basis and rationalize the decision making that went on, the process that went on, the good and the bad as well. Like I said before, you can make all of the right decisions, but still have a less than optimal outcome. And I think it's important, debriefing is a really important part of that process, whether that's, the immediate debrief on scene, or if that's a later after action debrief, which is a more formalized process. In my sector, we have models for this. We have something called SHOP AC, for briefing and debriefing, which is the idea of, situation hazards, objectives, plan, any questions, and confirmation understanding. It's a really quick boom, 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 boom checklist for delivering a brief, but also to briefing people coming onto a situation, or debriefing a situation. And I think these, in today's world, organizational learning is a huge deal. I was talking to some postgraduates about it the other day, and having the ability to, collate real-time good information, good learning, the good and the bad, good feedback from a situation, is a powerful tool for moving on. We've spoken so much today about how, the mind is so reliant on the mental models we build in, the experiential learning we experience, that actually debriefing and sharing that learning and sharing that understanding from these situations, which some situations, we deal with routinely. Some things, halo incidents, come along once in a career. So it's so important to capture that learning for it to then be, used to develop. I think it's a big deal. I think also multi-team debriefing, where everyone gets together, not just in your own silos, but, the whole system together, everyone, police, fire, ambulance, whoever's there, in NILO teams or teams and local authorities, when everyone gets together in a huddle, you have the opportunity to actually debrief in a way that actually captures understanding from all kinds of different frames as well, which again it builds that bigger picture. Because you only know what we know. I'm so conscious in terms of when I speak about decision making that my professional experience really comes from the operational side. I've got no experience of making strategic decisions. I'm not a strategic decision maker. God help us the day that ever happens. But I'm very conscious that when I speak about decision making, I'm looking at it from the perspective of someone who's very much in the operational level. Speaking to people more senior in the organisation, when I talk about decision making, I'm like, well, actually, I think a more analytical approach, a slower approach is very good. I'm like, well, of course you do, governor, because you're working in a context where you have the ability to turn up and take your time with decision making, and these kind of things. So I'm very conscious of that. So I think in terms of debriefing and sharing learning, I'm so conscious of being aware of my own biases, being aware of my own perspective. So I think if you step outside of that, and maybe this is what I've been fortunate enough to do through university, through that lecturing role, is to actually be able to step out of my own arena and actually experience the expertise in the wider room. And I'm not talking about expertise in terms of rank or role or qualifications. I'm talking about expertise in terms of people with real genuine skills, with a real skill set, a real ability to do their job in a really meaningful, effective way, and to be adaptive. And I think that's where the real key to learning comes from, development comes from.
Olly, listen, thank you for the last hour. It's been fantastic just to chat to you. Also, just get your thoughts and perspectives, as it's really nice to put across your experience from the domain of firefighting into pre-hospital care. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that. So, listen, thank you for the last hour. It's certainly something I'd like to revisit because there's a lot to still go at. But thanks, Olly.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.